Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Women Changing the World podcast. I'm seriously so excited to have Theresa Lieb here. She's a food systems analyst at GreenBiz. She knows so much about food, and she's had such an interesting life story and trajectory. I feel like we have way too much to talk about. So welcome, Theresa, to the podcast. It's so exciting to have you here.
Thank you, Liz. I'm so excited to be here with you.
Yay. Well, I love to start with the biggest question first, which is one that I know you've done some thinking about before, but because this is the Women Changing the World podcast, if you could change one thing about the world, what one thing would you want to change?
I would just want people to live in balance with nature more, and in my world, that is a big thing. That's basically changing the whole world and how we live in it. But I within that big bucket of things, I really focus on food and agriculture and how those systems connect to climate and biodiversity and health and communities, and trying to find some more balance through food in a very complex world that we're living in.
Totally, totally. I love that. That's a similar vein as a couple answers I've gotten so far this season on the podcast. And I could not agree more. I mean, I think it's something that we're so sorely in need of. I also realized I totally got ahead of myself and I meant to let you introduce yourself before asking the first big question. So if you wouldn't mind, for people who are listening who don't already know you, would you mind giving us just who you are in a nutshell, and we'll come back to your story in much more detail as we get into it.
Sure, happy to. So, my name is Teresa. I live in San Francisco with my partner and my dog, and I work as a food systems analyst at GreenBiz. GreenBiz is a media and events company focused on mostly on corporate sustainability, but on sustainability and climate more broadly as well. So, I do some writing, some conference convening around food and agriculture, and that has been kind of a big topic for me for my whole life, which we'll get to later, I think. But yeah, my background is in environmental science, and I've worked on different kind of land use systems in the past. In very internationally, I've worked in Ecuador and Brazil and Mexico, and I studied in the Netherlands and the UK, and somehow made my way over here. And yeah, I think that's me in a nutshell, I guess. And I grew up in Germany.
Totally. Well, thank you so much for that. I feel like you have such an interesting international background and body of work. It's so fascinating, and definitely want to talk more about all of that. I guess maybe before we get into kind of what brought you to being here today, I would love to hear a little bit more about what your day to day looks like right now. I know you write consistently, you have a newsletter, you write a column. What does the day to day? I know you have other things in addition to that on your plate, and I would love to hear more about what it looks like.
Yeah, good question. And I guess my day to day changes a little bit as well. As right now we're in an exciting place. At GreenBiz, we host a lot of pretty big conferences, and over the past 2 years, all of those have been online because of COVID. But we just had our first in-person conference in February, and it looks like we'll be hosting most of our conferences in person again this year, which is really fun. And so, a lot of my work, most of my time actually, is focused on thinking about how to convene a meaningful conference. Who are the people who should be there, and who needs to be talking to each other more, to take down some roadblocks that we have in climate and sustainability. How do we design better panels, and how do we connect people at those events when they come together? So a lot of kind of very nerdy topics that conference organizers think about. But then I also, I'm a food systems analyst, so I'm supposed to kind of have this big picture overview of everything that's happening within the food and agriculture sector. What are big companies doing? What are startups doing? What are the newest trends? Like, where do we have to, um, what can we be excited about? What do we have to examine critically as well? And then, that kind of like big picture analysis also uh, flows into my newsletter slash column that I write every week. And that goes out to about 11,000 subscribers right now. And so I try to, cover a lot of optimistic stories, because I think that's what we need a lot more of, to stay optimistic and stay motivated to do the hard work that people in the space do. But then also try to think about, okay, what are the things that aren't working well, and where do we have to push a little bit more with our storytelling.
Totally. Well, I think that's so interesting. And like, thinking about the global food system, it's like it touches everything. So
It does.
it's a lot to have your finger on the pulse of. And I would love to hear, I mean, I know like that I've gotten to have a little preview on this, but you've had such an interesting story, which you kind of previewed in your intro. So I'd love to hear like how you got to be where you are today. And really the invitation is to tell us the whole story. Like, don't feel like you have to
Yeah.
gloss over anything here. I think this is something that, both I and our listeners are always interested to hear how people kind of get into these dream roles.
Yeah, totally. And I love listening to the stories of the other women who came before me in your podcast, and it's very inspiring to hear, like how people came to be passionate about what they are passionate about, and the ups and downs and backs and forths of pathways, which I certainly have a bunch as well to talk about.
Oh, totally. Well, thank you so much for saying that. And yeah, I feel like the zigs and zags are like what make for a good story.
Yeah. Yeah. So, starting at the beginning, I grew up in a small village called Bartholome, which is in the south of Germany, kind of halfway between Munich and Stuttgart. Both of my grandparents were farmers. One of my uncles still has a pretty big dairy farm today, and the other, the farm of my mom's family, got closed down because my mom and none of her siblings wanted to take it over, and so it was just um, kind of empty buildings for a while, until my mom and my aunt started to open it back up as a restaurant. And so over the past 25 years, I think it is now, or 20 years, it kind of like slowly developed from this very small impromptu restaurant into one of the most sustainable event venues and little hotels in Germany, which is cool because it's kind of like a parallel path that my mom and I have been on over the past years. But at the beginning, like going back to where we started, I grew up in this small town in Germany, and nothing much really happened there. So when I graduated from high school, I really wanted to get out, and I always loved studying languages. And I had the opportunity to go on a few student exchanges during high school as well, to in France and Turkey and Australia, and really loved traveling. So I applied to this volunteer service in Germany, which is kind of similar to the Peace Corps program in the US. And I wanted to go to Mexico City because I wanted to go to a big city, like where things are happening, where a 19-year-old can have some fun, while also while also like learning Spanish, and of course saving the world in a little community project, which at the time I was still quite naive about what one person could accomplish, but that was the dream.
Oh my
And
gosh.
I
Well, at 19, weren't we all?
yeah, definitely. Yeah, but I applied too late, and the project in Mexico City was too full. But I got offered another project in Ecuador, in a village that was half the size of my village in Germany. And so I was like, oh no, like this is the opposite of what I wanted. But it was by the beach and it looked really beautiful. And so I was like, okay, I can, go and live by the beach for a year. That will be fun. And so I went and did that, and it was really fun, but it was also really transformational in how I got to understand, you know, the inequality in the world, and how where you grow up really shapes the opportunities that you have in life, and how poverty and environmental destruction and education are all kind of like intertwined, and it could be an upward spiral or a downward spiral depending on if a community gets lucky or not, or the different drivers that affect a place. So yeah, it was a really meaningful experience, and that kind of set me up on my career pathway as well. So from there, I went back to Germany, and I enrolled myself in law school, which in Germany, university degrees we don't have the liberal arts and science or general education college system. Most people do a specialized program from the start. So you go straight from high school into law school or biology or whatever you want to study. So I decided that I wanted to study law because I thought that I could, being a lawyer, you're powerful and you can make the world a better place and uh, help different communities. But I soon realized that law school was more about studying, all these little um, laws and very, very rabbit hole kind of questions, and not really so much about the big justice and ethical questions that I had in my mind after coming back from Ecuador to my own life back home. And so I dropped out after 6 months and enrolled myself in a very different program in the Netherlands, which was a liberal arts and science college where I studied international development and could really kind of dive a little bit deeper into those issues of inequality and environmental conservation and climate that I was really personally struggling with at the time, and also felt like would be the defining issues of our generation, and that's where I really wanted to work on. And yeah, it was a great school, very international, very small, so I had very close interaction with professors, and got really lucky to kind of be in an environment where I had a lot of support, because I was a first generation student, so my family couldn't really support me much in going to school, and didn't really know how to help me and what the things are that you need to do to be successful. But yeah, so I got lucky to be in this kind of very small community. What was the next step? So after, yeah, in college, I also did an exchange program in Brazil. So I studied in Sao Paulo for 6 months, and then learned Portuguese while I was there.
Oh my gosh,
And
just casually learned Portuguese.
well, you kind of have to when you're in a place that only speaks one language, and
Totally.
I like people, so um, yeah. So that's like one tip: if you want to learn a language, just go to a place where people speak only that language and stay there for 6 months, and I promise you will learn it. That that I think is the easiest way to do it. Yeah, and so that was really fun. I learned Portuguese, and that set me up for my first job after college, where I went back to Brazil and I did two traineeships with the German development kind of institutions. So still focused on development at the time, and so I worked 6 months for the German Development Bank, and then afterwards for the German Development Service, which are similar but independent institutions. And that work was focused on preventing deforestation in the Amazon and supporting local communities in the Amazon to develop kind of ecotourism and alternative economies based on the natural resources there so that they would have more of an economic incentive to protect the Amazon rather than participate in deforestation. And that was really interesting work, but also frustrating because it felt kind of small scale and you work on this project by project base. And then during that time, I also learned a lot about, the drivers of deforestation and environmental degradation in Brazil. And a lot of that stems from agriculture. And so in the end, I felt like, well, if we really want to tackle this issue from the start, from the beginning, from the source of it, we need to think about agriculture and diets and global consumption. And so that was the topic that I decided I wanted to hone in on and wanted to learn more about. And I just kind of took a moonshot in what seemed at the time like a moonshot and applied to some of the best master's programs focusing on diet and climate change and agriculture, food systems more broadly. And I really wanted to go to Oxford because there was this one professor called Tara Garnett who had written some of the lead papers at the time on this topic. But, coming from where I came from, I never thought that I would get into Oxford. And I only applied because one of my college professors had gone there to do his PhD, and he was like, "No, Theresa, like you can you could totally get accepted." And so I was like, I might as well give it a try, but it probably won't work out. So I also applied to like 10 other backup schools, and it worked out. I still remember being in Brazil. Like I was out with friends in this little fast food restaurant, I think, before heading out to a weekend trip. And I checked my email on my phone and I saw the acceptance letter and I just couldn't believe it. I was like, what? How is this possible? And like, just like was sitting there in this little restaurant and crying. And it was really cool. And yeah, I just never felt like, I would be the kind of person who could be part of that world, which seemed like a different kind of universe to me.
Totally,
Yeah,
totally, which is so cool because I feel like knowing you now, I'm like, oh, of course you got into Oxford, but I can also totally appreciate how in the moment it felt like such a like wild dream. And what was it like to go there, especially as a first generation student?
it was really cool. Oxford is a beautiful place. It's a really cool student town. It's a relatively small town, and the university is kind of dispersed across the whole city. So you have these beautiful buildings everywhere. Like there's so many young people on the streets and all the cafes and libraries. It's just a really really cool place, and you meet people from all around the world studying all these really interesting things and crazy things. And there's a lot of nerds, but also just a lot of normal nice people. So and I think that's especially true in the master's programs. The master's programs are a lot more international than the undergrad programs, which are, I think, a little bit more of what you imagine from like British high society, kind of going there and studying in their fancy dorm rooms. But yeah, I had a really good experience, and I studied. My program was at the geography school, and we did a lot of field trips. So we had like 3 or 4 or even 5 field trips in one year, going to all these different conservation areas in the UK. And so that was a really fun way to connect more deeply with some of the professors, but also my classmates. And in my first year, I lived in a big house that was run by my college with 20 or so other students. And then in my second year, I moved into a co-op with 10 other people who were all doing like different programs. So it was just a really fun time. And I think I probably learned more from all those interactions and meeting people than from school itself, which I think is probably true for most. And like in terms of school, it was yeah, it couldn't have been more different to my undergrad experience because I went from this 300-person college to this huge, global kind of university where with my advisor. I had a really great advisor, but all the professors are just so busy with their research and don't really have a lot of time to, read your essays and comment on it and give you personalized feedback and all of that. So it's very much of like, if you want something from someone, you have to go chase them, and no one's gonna, really, really care about what you do if you don't make it happen. Yeah, so that was fun, and I guess one big part of it at Oxford, I also met my partner, who he also studied abroad in Brazil, and he hosted a little kind of seminar where he invited a speaker from Brazil to talk about rainforest deforestation. And I read about it in like some of the event newsletters, and went to the event, and that's how we met. And we're still together like 5 years later now, and that's how. And he's from San Francisco, so that's kind of how I moved to the Bay Area after graduating from Oxford.
Oh, so cool.
Yeah.
What a like weird like geographic synergy.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. And, I would have never expected to live in San Francisco at some point. And that's like something that you always feel like you want to make your 5-year plans and have an idea of what life is going to be like. And then you make all these plans, and just like everything ends up being completely different because of something like this. You fall in love with someone who's from the other side of the world, and then you just pack up and move to a different place. So yeah.
Totally. Well, I don't think everyone always does that, but I absolutely love that that has been your story.
Yeah, fair enough.
So you're at Oxford, you've met your partner, and then how do you get from Oxford to San Francisco? What did that look like?
um yeah, that was a challenging time for me. Well, first I had to wait for a long time for my visa to get processed and actually being able to move here. But also, I didn't really know anyone in the Bay Area. And so I think finding your first real job after university is already hard. But then if you combine that with moving to a different continent, it's even harder. And, at the time, I was still kind of like, okay, well, I have all this experience. I had some work experience already. I have all this international experience. I speak all these languages. I went to Oxford. I got my degree. Uh, of course, everybody wants to hire me, but that definitely wasn't the case. So I went through a long process of application, applying to all kinds of things like startups and NGOs and companies working on food and agriculture and climate and conservation in the Bay Area. But I just had a hard time finding anything. And then after maybe 4 or 5 months of applying to stuff, and at the time I was lucky because um, my advisor at Oxford, she needed a research assistant at the time. So I was working kind of like part time remotely with her. And I had another project that I was consulting on that stemmed from one of my internships in Brazil that I did before. So I had some income, but nothing, not a real job. And yeah, just came here and didn't really know anyone, and I was job searching. So it was a difficult time. But then eventually someone believed in me and hired me. So my first real job was at WeWork, the which probably most people know, uh, big kind of like office office locations. And there I managed the global food program, which a lot of people are surprised about. WeWork having a food program, but is all the coffee and drink service and catering service, and just people eat food while they work. So that's why we worked had a food program, and in some locations we had kind of little built-in cafes and all of that, and it was a really cool job. We had an amazing team, probably like one of the biggest sustainability teams a company's ever had, and we're trying to do some pretty like innovative things as well. And what's was going well. I loved it. Had a great colleagues, but then WeWork tried to IPO, and like that didn't work out, and the company got into a hard place financially, and most of our team got laid off, which was really hard. And just like being in that work environment where you know that things aren't going well, and a lot of people are getting laid off, and you're just anxious that you might lose your job every day, and that really influences how well you can perform at your job. And so that was a difficult time. But eventually, my role was kept along with um, a handful of others because we had more operational roles than some of our colleagues. And so I stayed on for 4 or 5 months after the first big round of layoffs happened. But then the company went through, restructuring, consistent restructuring, consistent leadership change, and we just weren't really able to get anything done anymore. And so I decided that I was kind of wasting my time and just quit. And I had some consulting projects before I quit. I had some consulting projects lined up, um, and yeah, just wanted to get out of it and be more productive again, and do go back to doing project-based consulting work before finding kind of another role that would make sense for me.
Totally. But oh my gosh, that's so crazy after working so hard and being so patient to find the dream role to have it
Yeah,
go that way is so heartbreaking.
it was because everything was perfect, and then it just disappeared. But yeah,
Totally.
that's how life is. And still, I still learned a lot during the time I was there, and reaffirmed my interest in food, and also corporate sustainability. Kind of, I think I'm always a little bit torn about, you know are companies really the ones shifting our impact? But that's just like the economic system that we live in right now, and companies buy and produce um, everything or most things that we have in the world. So I think it's a good place to start um, if you want to be pragmatic about change.
Totally, totally. Well, if I remember correctly, WeWork did do some pretty innovative things on the food front while you were there in terms of some of their policy shifts.
Yeah, yeah, we were a meat-free company, so I think that was something that got a lot of headlines, and we had a lot of like employee engagement internally, with some people not being happy, many people being excited about it, but it just being a great venue for education and conversation about sustainability. We had um, some some pretty cool reuse, so packaging reuse programs. For example, in our location in London, all our milk got delivered in reusable glass bottles, and we had these local systems in place. We shifted our coffee procurement to sustainable coffee during my time there, which was huge because people drink a lot of coffee at work, so we were was buying a ton of coffee. So yeah, like things were happening, and that was the exciting thing, to be at a company like that already had scale but still pretty flat hierarchies. So some I was the person in charge of food, and I actually could make some of these decisions relating to food relatively quickly, and change things around. And also because the founders of WeWork really were down for making the company more sustainable, and really took the impact that they had on the world as seriously as they could.
Totally, totally. Well, so you did some really cool stuff while you were there. You eventually decided it was time to leave. You had some consulting projects lined up. How did you get from going back to project-based consulting to where you are today?
Yeah, so I was doing consulting projects again after WeWork, and that was also when COVID started. So everybody went into home offices for COVID, and I did I did my projects, and that was fun. I still look back on being a consultant in like very positively, because I'm someone who's like very curious, and I loved working on different kinds of projects, but it has other downsides, obviously. But my primary kind of motivation for wanting to go back to a team environment was, one, feeling too isolated, especially during COVID, because I worked independently, and then I was just at home and wasn't interacting with a lot of people on my day-to-day in my day-to-day life. So I wanted to change that. And then I also kind of reflected on the time that I had spent at WeWork in a team environment, and then the time I had spent as an independent consultant, and realized that I just um, learned a lot more and developed a lot more skills being in a team environment, because you learn a lot more from others. And so, being still relatively early in my career, I felt like it would be more beneficial to go back to working with a team and just like learn from others and be in a more interactive environment. So that's the first answer to that question. And the second answer is that GreenBiz was actually one of my consulting clients. I had a small project with them
Oh,
to work on one
cool.
of to work on one of the conferences, and I got to know the team through that. And yeah, and just felt like they were doing cool work. And I also had learned, like, over the different kind of roles and projects that I had in the years before, that the team it has so much influence on your experience and your ability to perform, that in the decision that I was making at that time, I really wanted to make sure that I was working with a good team and that I had a supportive manager. And that was, at the time, I guess, maybe even a little bit more important to me than the role itself. And so I guess that's something that I learned over time, that at the beginning I was entirely looking for um, the role, and like, what would my day-to-day activities be? What are my responsibilities? What is the change that I can make through the work, and not so much at the culture and the team environment and things like that. But I realized that that is actually a really important piece of the puzzle of yeah, being happy and productive at work.
Totally. I think so often, especially in the impact space, we do like really focus on the impact and the work, but having worked with so many, women in these careers, I'm like increasingly of the opinion that like you can do almost anything if you really like the people that you're doing it with and for,
Yeah,
and you like generally feel like it's making a positive impact.
yeah, for sure. And also, like, all of my leadership role models in my life, and the positive ones until now, have been women. And I have like two bad kind of work relationships in the past, and both of those were with men. And so I was like, I'm not gonna work. I never want to have a male manager again. And of course, now at GreenBiz, I report to my manager is a man, Jim, but he's actually amazing. So I can confirm that there are exceptions.
Oh,
but
totally,
uh,
totally.
but that
There's some
yeah,
great men leading
there's some
teams.
great there's some great men leading teams, but definitely at some point I was like, I'm never gonna report to a man again. Like, I'm done with them, and I want to have just female leaders. Which I still want to see more of, but I Jim is restoring my confidence a little bit.
Oh, I love that. I feel like it's so interesting when we like have these ideas. Like you were so clear on prioritizing. Like I want to prioritize the leader, I want to prioritize the team and the culture. And then you're like confronted with like the opportunity has something about it that seems like the opposite of what you wanted. It sounds like it actually is all the things that you wanted, but you had to like rewrite
Yeah,
that script a little bit in the process.
yeah, yeah, for sure.
Well, that's so interesting. Thank you so much for sharing kind of how you came to be where you are today. And I feel like given the work that you do, which is again so interesting, there's so much I could ask you about. I guess the first thing I'm kind of curious about, knowing, first of all, I heard great things about GreenBiz. We're talking in March, so it was last month. I know this episode will come out a little bit later. But I'm curious, like, what's your take on like why conferences matter in 2022? I think it's been really interesting to have gone through almost 2 years without conferences and now be thinking about like what does the future of gathering professionally look like?
Yeah, that's a great question, and like something that I have been thinking about a lot as I started this role, and as I was reflecting also on what is so the challenging part of the job that I have and that um, my colleagues are doing at GreenBiz as well is that when you work in media and events, it's really hard to measure your impact. You know, like what have you can't say, oh, I've changed the procurement of like coffee for 500,000 people. You don't really have those very quantitative statistics. It's more like you bring people together and connect them, and then new partnerships form, and people get motivated again to do their work. And so it's a little bit more fuzzy. Um, but going to my first in-person GreenBiz conference after COVID in February was really transformative. I think the most important piece of it for me right now is that is to give people that sense of community within the sustainability and impact space where people know, okay, like I'm not alone in doing this work. I'm not the only one who hasn't figured it out. There is like a whole tribe that I belong to, and all these people want to, really change the emissions of their companies and turn around their supply chains and think about how workers are treated and human rights and all these issues. And I think the work that people in this space do can be really hard and emotionally draining. And you're like confronted with this huge existential crisis every day at work. And it's really hard to you know, stay motivated and feel like you're in control of like this little tiny piece that you're working on, and also take care of your mental health and all of that. And I think that gathering with people and just exchanging and getting support is a really important piece of making this work personally sustainable for the people in it for the long term.
Totally. No, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I do think it's like so often people doing this work, you're a small team or a team of one, and it feels
Yeah.
like you're trying to turn like a massive ship. And so spending time, making the time, even when you have a ton on your plate, to spend time with other people who are trying to turn their respective ships, I think can be so helpful in feeling like you're not alone in trying to do this work.
Yeah, it's so crazy to me to see how small sustainability teams still are. It's like some of the I've talked to someone who's leading all the supply chain work for like one of the biggest food companies in the world, and they're like a three-person team. And they're supposed to cut emissions by 50% in the next 5 years. And so I'm like, how on earth is that going to happen? And of course, they work with a lot of consultants and service providers and in partnerships with other companies and all of that, but it's still like very monumental piece of work. And yeah, and then I think that's where the second part of conferences comes in. It's in terms of the content, it's just convening of the important topics, of the important, new frameworks that are developing, new technologies as well, risks and benefits of those. So I think it's just like an easy way to um, kind of get an overview of the space and like where you are in comparison to other companies, and what are the things that you can implement into your day-to-day work that will make you more effective in your job.
Totally, totally. And to get a sense of like, yeah, what are the like coolest, newest things that are
Yeah.
happening? So you have something to like have on your like next to-do list.
Definitely.
Well, and I'm curious, I know GreenBiz has done some interesting stuff on like their food policy for conferences. And I'm curious too, like what your take is on like why and how other organizations need to change their food policies. But maybe if you don't mind sharing like some of the GreenBiz updates first, and then would love to hear your philosophy around that.
Yeah, so I have been a long-term advocate of um, changing diets to more plant-based, plant-rich kind of options because if you look at emissions within the food system, the bulk of the emissions really comes from the production of meat and dairy and other animal products. And also, environmental degradation is really closely linked to that. So, that by that I mean deforestation and the conversion of grasslands in the US and in other places. So, there's a lot of negative environmental and also social outcomes, pollution, local pollution from factory farming and industrial animal agriculture. And I'm not saying that all kind of animal agriculture is bad. There are a lot of farms and ranchers who are really doing amazing work. But if we look at the big picture production, a lot of that is really destructive. And people, especially in the US, are also over consuming those products. So it's detrimental for their personal health as well. And so, advocating for rethinking our diets, like reducing the high meat and dairy consumption, replacing it with more fruits and vegetables and nuts and grains and just like more plant-based whole foods, I think is really important. And all the big climate models and climate assessments, even like from the IPCC, have shown that without doing that, without changing the way we eat globally, we won't be able to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. So it's like an essential thing to do. But people have a really hard time changing their diets. It's very personal. It's very habitual. It's really hard to change those behaviors and also your preferences and taste and all of that. And so, like within that, institutional procurement has a really important role to play in exposing people to different foods and dishes that they wouldn't necessarily cook for themselves at home, and just um, providing examples for other healthy and tasty foods that are at the same time a lot more sustainable. And that's why we changed our policies at GreenBiz. And we did that for the first time for our conference in February. So we served 75% vegan meals and 25% vegetarian meals. Yeah, and that was an interesting experiment. And there's other like institutional procurement initiatives going on in the US. So, for example, in New York, they're going to do one plant-based day in schools, I
Oh,
think,
cool.
starting, I don't know exactly when it starts, but that's an initiative that has just been announced. And then there's like Meatless Mondays that has been around for a while. So, different campaigns in this space trying to impact institutional procurement, because that's also where food gets bought in these big volumes. And if one of these like big government institutions changes their policies, it actually makes a big impact on the supply chain overall.
Totally, totally. Thank you so much for sharing that. And that is really interesting to think about, like just the fact that it's exposing people to different choices that they wouldn't have made for themselves. I don't know if I would have thought about it in those terms, but that makes so much
Yeah,
sense.
yeah, and it's hard to get it right. I think the it's really challenging. There, there's really amazing vegan and vegetarian food out there, but only if you know how to cook it. And the sad thing is that like traditional training, like chef's training and chef's education, doesn't really incorporate that a whole lot. Like the traditional training that you get if you go to culinary school is all about meat and dairy and kind of like the traditional French cuisine. And so there's really like this big skill gap within the food service environment that we have to address if we want to get people more excited about sustainable food. And so our venue, for example, at our conference, they did it relatively well, but not perfectly. And so it's something that we also kind of decided that we are going to invest in and give those culinary teams a chance to learn and experiment as well. at the conference. And so, yeah, over time, as more and more people request that, and there's more demand for it, hopefully the quality of it and the excitement of the food will also improve.
Totally, totally. That makes a lot of sense. Well, and I feel like there's so much I want to ask you about, but um, I would love to change gears a little bit. You've
Yeah,
lived abroad in so many places for shorter stints, than obviously for longer stints like now. I know you're also a big believer that everyone should live abroad at least once in their life. And I'm curious, like, one, why do you think everyone should live abroad at least once in their life? And two, what tips do you have for meeting new people and making friends in a new city as an adult? Because I know that's not an easy thing to do.
good question. The second one, especially like during these times where people are, still in their little bubbles a little bit. But I'll start with the first one. I think um, living abroad just opens up your horizon. You get to know different people, different cultures, different food. You get to travel. You meet people that have very different experiences and worldviews to your own. And I think it's just really important in terms of understanding how the world works, but also understanding where you came from and like what shaped how you view the world and your own privilege, maybe. Um, and yeah, and just like getting out of your comfort zone, going to a place where you don't know anyone and you have to make friends is hard, but it's also liberating because all these new people don't have any expectations for how you're supposed to be or who you're supposed to be or how you're supposed to behave. Like you can kind of go to a new place and reinvent yourself every time if you want to. So that's also really fun. And I think the other piece that has been really meaningful to me in getting to know different places and cultures and how people do things and how cities are organized and policies and politics in different countries is that oftentimes when we say or think something's impossible, it's not really, because other people in some other place in the world are doing it. And
Mm-hmm.
so just getting that inspiration and like knowing that things are possible and that there are different ways of doing something while still living a good life is like totally doable. And I think is especially important in the sustainability and impact world where we are trying to come up with these better solutions. And a lot of those solutions already exist in a place. We just need to kind of like find them and then understand why are they working there and how can we take that and adapt it to a different environment.
Totally, totally. Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I think it is so expansive. And I also am gonna circle back and
And it's also
reinforce the
just really,
question.
really fun,
Yeah, the
right?
question on
I
make
mean, that
yeah,
too. Yeah.
totally. I mean, I think it could be such a fun adventure. But then how do you make new friends as an adult in a new place?
Yeah, I'm still kind of trying to figure that out. So, um, in all my other like places that I've moved to in the past, it's always been for an internship or a program or or a job or something very specific where like when you arrive, you're already part of a community, and that has been harder this time around when I moved to San Francisco because I didn't really like come here with anything set up. And my partner, he grew up here, so he has like a network that I was able to tap into. But for me, it's also just always been important to have like my own group of friends that I can hang out with, just to it's something that I need to feel kind of complete. And yeah, and I'm not someone who plays a lot like group sports. I'm not not talented at all with that, and I think that would be a great way to make friends and connect with people. So finding other like just being open to things that seem kind of weird to do at the beginning. So for example, I went to like these different meetup groups, or I did friend dating on Bumble.
I love
And
that. I've heard rave reviews of
yeah,
Bumble Friend or Bumble
yeah, it's
BFF, I think it's called, right?
yes, that's what it's called, and it's really fun. And I actually made like three really good friends through that. yeah, and then like I also made friends through work, but I guess like during COVID work that has become a lot more difficult. But yeah, I think you just have to be like more outgoing and persistent than you would otherwise be. And I think in the Bay Area specifically, it seems harder because people are so busy and a lot of people are always like doing trips on the weekend and are not actually around that much. And so if you only see someone like once a month, it's just hard to develop a relationship. But yeah, I think with a lot of patience and persistence, you can, you can meet people and just like trying different kind of uh, methods to connect.
Absolutely, absolutely. Um, well, in the interest of time, I have one more kind of deep question for you, and then a couple kind of brief ones.
Okay.
I'm so torn because I have a couple in mind, but I know that like you of all the people in my world, I mean, I think a lot of people in my world also subscribe to this belief that like we are not our work. I also know this
Mhm.
belief is like really hard when you work in our space. And so I'm curious, like, how do you balance career goals and your life? And how do you find joy outside of your job?
I think, yeah, that is a really important one. And as I've talked about a little bit before, it's just really important to have balance if you want to keep up like really good work over a long period of time. And like one thing for me is I feel very lucky to have grown up in a place where taking long vacations and like taking a lot of time off is just like the standard thing to do. So Germany has a very different work culture than the US, and just having, and Europe in general, I think people have a better work-life balance just culturally than here, and also in Latin America too. People are much more focused on like their sports and family and social life, and not so much career oriented. So, having that exposure helps me balance a little bit better how I spend my own time. But obviously, you're always influenced by the people who are in your immediate environment. So that has become a bit harder in the US, and also during COVID, like when not so much, not so many exciting things are happening anyways. You feel like, oh, you might as well keep working because what else could you be doing? But yeah, like one thing, I have a dog, and so he needs to go out every day. Uh, and so at least, I start my morning by going on a long walk with him, and I make my coffee and grab him, and then like first go outside, which I think already sets me up for a much better start into the day than going straight to my laptop. And then, yeah, in the evening, same thing. I try to stop working by 5 and go get some exercise or meet up with someone, uh, read a book, watch a movie. And then on the weekends, I have a very strict no weekend work kind of policy and culture. And so I almost never do any work on weekends and just like try to completely disconnect. And that really helps me to re-energize. And I love cooking too. Food is really important to me. And so I can't just like eat crappy food every day. So that means that I have to spend time cooking.
I love it. And you are
Yeah.
fully vegan, correct?
Mostly, not 100%, but at home I'm fully vegan, and then I make exceptions for kind of like cultural experiences, and sometimes when I hang out with groups and are more flexible then. But so I'm trying to keep, yeah, the impact as low as possible, but I'm not completely strict with it.
Oh, cool. That seems like such
Too.
a balanced approach. Especially like, yeah, just thinking about like when you're at home and you have obviously the most control over what goes on your plate, prioritizing that, but being open.
Yeah. Yeah, and I tried to at the beginning be completely vegan, but it's yeah, it's just been hard because food isn't just, functional. It has a lot of emotional and cultural components to it, which I think we have to take into consideration as well. So, for example, like the first year when I decided to be vegan, and then I went home for Christmas to visit my family, and I basically like couldn't eat anything, and my grandma like made all these cookies and things, and she was really upset that I wouldn't eat any of them and didn't really like get the whole vegan thing. So I think it's, trying to find balance between the impact and on the environment on the one hand, and then people in your life on the other hand, and yeah, finding a middle ground somewhere is important.
Yes, absolutely. Um, well, I'm curious if you are going to give some advice to your younger self. What advice would you want to give to your younger self? And you can like pick a specific age or just give like general younger self advice.
I think advice that I would give to my like a little desperate me after graduating from school and looking for a job is like, you'll find something great eventually, and it might not be what you think it is, but just have some faith. I think I would say, and to my younger self, I think actually I've done a pretty good job at just kind of enjoying life and getting to know a lot of different places. Um, so I wouldn't really recommend my younger self to do things differently.
Hmm. I love that. And I can't tell you, I feel like so many millennial-ish women, especially like finishing school at the times that we finished school, like just telling our younger selves, like, hold the vision, like, have faith, it will be okay. It's
Yeah,
so real.
definitely. And it's easy to say now. It's hard to, keep motivated when you're in it and when you just uh, get rejection email after rejection. Yeah,
Yeah,
but
the struggle is
it is
real.
it is possible. And also, I think that right now, I hope that for graduates right now it becomes easier because there's like a lot more jobs in this space now, which is really exciting. So hopefully people will have less hard of a time these days.
hmm I definitely hope so. Um, Last question. I ask everyone this because I know so many women in my world, myself very much included, have inspirational post-it notes all over our computers, desks, walls, mirrors, of just little reminders and notes to self. And so I'm curious, like if you got to like give everyone listening a message or a phrase for an inspirational post-it note, what would you most want to put on yours?
Yeah, I'm not much of a posted person and inspirational person. I think my my mom had tons of inspirational quotes everywhere, and I think maybe because of that I kind of doled out from them a little bit, and and my partner actually always makes fun of like when we go home to visit my family, like of all these signs and like things everywhere, and a lot of them are in English, and he's like, that is so funny that people in Germany have all these like English inspirational quotes, like what's up with that. But yeah, just a side note to that. But I know that you asked this question. So one quote that I have kept on my notebook for a while and that I still like is from Arundhati Roy. It's not, I didn't make it up myself. But it reads, "A new world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing." And that's something that's, meaningful to me in terms of trying to listen carefully and trying to stay optimistic and be be patient and faithful, but also kind of lean into that female power and healing a little bit.
Mm. I love that. You gave me chills when you read it. So thank you so much for sharing and indulging, even if it's not your thing per se.
Yeah,
Well,
of course.
well, and I absolutely love your newsletter. I like love the content that you're putting out. I feel like you're really shining a spotlight on so many areas for like hope and optimism and opportunities to take action in the food space. So I'm curious if anyone's listening and wants more info or a place to connect with you, where's the best place for them to find you?
Thank you. Yeah, so people can find me on Twitter and LinkedIn, just like search for my name and it'll come up. And then also, when you go on greenbiz.com and then look up my name there, I have like an author page where all my articles are listed so people can read all the stuff that I've written in the past. And then obviously I have my weekly newsletter that comes out every Thursday that is open for everyone to subscribe to, and that can also be found on the GreenBiz website. So yeah, subscribers welcome.
I love it. Well, and I'll be sure to include links to those in the show notes too for anyone who's
Thank
listening.
you.
Awesome. Well, oh my gosh, Theresa, I could have talked to you for hours, and I feel like much more to come because I feel like I could have talked to you for hours. But thank you so much for making time to hop on the Women Changing the World podcast. It's been so fun to hear your story and go deep with you on all things food and international relocation and everything in between.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me and for hosting this podcast. As I've told you before, I think it's such a great kind of spark of joy and optimism to have in my Spotify, that on some of the dark days where I don't want to listen to any news or any like deep analysis of politics and stuff, and just want to get some inspiration, it's such a good podcast to tune into. So thank you for bringing it to life.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. I so appreciate it.